Stella Keene had done a great many things that respectable women in the Arizona Territory of 1883 were not supposed to do, but the document she pulled from her leather satchel on a Tuesday morning in the town of Red Rock Crossing was without question the most scandalous of all of them. She spread it flat on the countertop of the general store, smoothed the creases with her palms, and stood back to look at it the way a painter might look at a finished canvas. 4 pages. Written in her own precise hand, every word chosen with the deliberate care of a woman who had watched 3 different men propose to her, with the assumption that she would simply fold herself into whatever shape they required. She had declined all 3, politely the first time, firmly the second, and with a bucket of well water the third, which had caused a considerable scene outside the post office that people in Red Rock Crossing still talked about on slow afternoons. The document was a marriage contract. Not the kind that lawyers drew up to transfer property rights from one man to another man through the medium of a woman's name. This was something else entirely. This was Stella Keene's own terms, laid out in numbered paragraphs, covering everything from joint ownership of any property acquired during the marriage, to the right to maintain her own finances, to the explicit statement that any man who signed his name at the bottom was entering a partnership, not taking possession of a piece of livestock. She did not expect anyone to sign it. That was the honest truth. She had written it in the long, quiet hours after her father's death the previous winter, when the ranch he had left her had suddenly become a point of legal contention, because she was an unmarried woman and certain men in the county had decided that meant the land was available. She had written it because writing things down had always been her way of making them real, and what she needed to be real right now was the idea that there existed some man somewhere on this earth who would look at what she had written and not immediately laugh or lecture her about the natural order of things. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up because it was practical, not because anyone told her to. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and 10 years of experience running a cattle ranch that most men in the county had assumed would fail the moment Thomas Keene breathed his last. The ranch had not failed. The cattle were healthy. The fences were sound. She paid her 3 ranch hands on time every month, and she had a reputation in the surrounding counties for fair dealing that she considered her most valuable possession. What she did not have was a legal husband, and without a legal husband, a clause buried in the county deed records meant that the Keene Ranch was vulnerable to a forced sale petition that had been filed 4 months ago by a man named Gerald Hooper who owned the adjacent property and had been trying to acquire her land since before her father was cold in the ground. The marriage contract was, at its core, a desperate act dressed up in very precise language. She had come to the general store not to find a husband, but to pick up a crate of supplies that Emmett Foss, the storekeeper, had set aside for her. Emmett was 62, happily married, and one of the few people in Red Rock Crossing she genuinely trusted, which was why she had told him about the contract, and why he had, without judgment, agreed to let her leave a copy posted on his notice board beside the announcements about lost horses and church socials. She was tacking it up when the bell above the door rang. She did not turn around immediately. She finished pressing the tack into the corner of the document, stepped back, and only then looked toward the door. The man who came in was not from Red Rock Crossing. She knew every face in this town and several faces in the 4 towns nearest to it, and she had never seen this one. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with trail dust on his coat and a quality about his stillness that made her think of the old cottonwood at the edge of her north pasture, the one that had survived 3 floods and a lightning strike, and still stood like it had no particular concerns about the future. He had dark hair cut short, a jaw that carried about 2 days of stubble, and eyes the color of strong coffee that were, at this moment, reading the notice board with an expression she could not immediately categorize. He was not laughing. He read the whole thing. She watched him do it. He stood there with his hat in his hand and his saddlebags over one shoulder, and he read all 4 pages, his eyes moving slowly and carefully down each line, the way a man reads something he actually intends to understand rather than something he is merely performing interest in. When he finished, he turned around. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Is this yours?" She said, "It is." He said, "The clause about joint decision-making on all land sales. Does that include leasing arrangements?" She blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. "It does," she said carefully. "Any transaction involving the property requires mutual agreement in writing." He nodded slowly, as if that was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "And the financial arrangement in paragraph 6, the separate household accounts, that's modeled on some of the partnership agreements I've seen in business contracts." "It is," she said. "Marriage is, functionally, a partnership. I do not see why the legal structure should be different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where do I sign?" The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the flies buzzing against the window glass and the distant sound of a horse stamping its foot somewhere on the main street outside. "I beg your pardon," she said. He set his saddlebags down on the floor and his hat on the counter, and he turned back to the notice board and pointed at the signature line at the bottom of the last page. "Where do I sign?" he said again. "I'm asking because there appear to be 2 lines at the bottom. One for you and one for the other party. I'm assuming the other party is whoever agrees to these terms, and I'm telling you that I agree to these terms. So I'm asking where I sign." Stella Keene had been prepared for mockery. She had been prepared for outrage. She had been prepared for the particular brand of patronizing amusement that men in this territory seem to keep in endless supply. She had not been prepared for this. "You don't even know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know a fair contract when I read one." He paused. "My name is Albert Carver. I've been riding for 3 weeks from Tucson looking for work or land or some combination of the two. I have $140 in my boot and a good horse outside and enough experience with cattle to be useful. I'm 28 years old, I have no family obligations, no outstanding debts, and no criminal record in any of the 4 territories I've passed through." He said all of this with the matter-of-fact directness of a man presenting references to a potential employer, which, she realized with a start, was exactly what he was doing. She crossed her arms. That's a very practical introduction for a man proposing marriage. That's a very practical marriage contract for a woman posting it in a general store, he said. She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them looked away. "Emmett," Stella said without turning her head. The storekeeper, who had been very intently reorganizing a shelf of tinned goods that did not need reorganizing, cleared his throat. "Yes, Miss Keene. Do you have a pen behind that counter?" "I do." "Bring it out, please." There was a pause. Then Emmett Foss set down a tin of peaches and went to find his pen, and Stella Keene turned back to Albert Carver and thought that whatever this was, it was the most interesting thing that had happened to her in the better part of a year. She did not let him sign that day. She had written the contract in careful terms, and one of those terms, in paragraph 2, stated clearly that both parties would have a period of no less than 30 days to discuss and negotiate any clauses before signatures were affixed. She had included that clause because she was a fair woman, and she believed in informed consent on both sides, and she was not about to violate her own contract simply because she was surprised. What she did do was invite Albert Carver to have a cup of coffee at the diner across the street. He accepted without hesitation. They sat at the corner table, the one by the window that looked out onto Main Street, and Stella asked him questions the way she checked cattle for soundness, methodically, without apology. Where had he grown up? What kind of work had he done? Why had he left Tucson? What did he know about running a ranch in clay soil country with unpredictable water rights? He answered every question. He had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 sons on a small farm that had been swallowed by debt when he was 17. He had come west because there was nothing left to stay for. He had worked as a hired hand on 2 different ranches in New Mexico and one in southern Arizona, and he had spent 18 months driving cattle on a route between the Mexican border and the rail depot at Yuma. He had left Tucson because the man who employed him there had sold his operation to a land company from back east and let all his hands go, and Albert had decided that he was done working other men's land for other men's profit if he could find any reasonable alternative. He told all of this without complaint and without embellishment. He did not make himself sound better than he was, and he did not make the circumstances sound worse than they were. She noted both things. She told him about the Keene Ranch, about the 340 acres her father had homesteaded in 1864, the year before she was born, about the cattle and the water rights and the clay soil that could be difficult in dry years but held moisture beautifully after a good rain, about Gerald Hooper and the forced sale petition and the county deed clause that had been written by men who had clearly never considered that a woman might be capable of running property she had legally inherited. Albert listened the way he did everything else she had observed, completely, without interruption, with his eyes on her face rather than on the window or his coffee cup. When she finished, he said, "So the marriage is protective." "Partly," she said, "but I want to be honest with you, Mr. Carver. A marriage for purely legal protection would be a dishonest arrangement, and I have no interest in dishonest arrangements. What I want is a genuine partnership with someone who will respect the terms laid out in that contract. If that partnership grows into something more, then that would be a welcome thing. If it doesn't, then we have still made something functional and honest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're the most direct person I've met in 3 years of traveling. Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's a relief." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the dusty street, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something it had probably frightened itself, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table between them like something warm and unhurried. 30 days, she said. "You can stay on the ranch. I have a bunkhouse with 1 spare bunk. My hands are named Roy Clem, and young Pete Navarro, who is 17 and very good with horses. You'll work for your keep during the 30 days, and at the end of it, if either of us has decided this is not going to work, we part ways cleanly. If we both decide to proceed, we go to the Justice of the Peace in Reed Rock Crossing and make it official." "What are the terms for the 30-day period?" he asked. She reached into her satchel, which she had brought with her to the diner, and produced a folded sheet of paper. "I anticipated the possibility that someone might respond with genuine interest," she said, "so I prepared a provisional agreement for the evaluation period." He took the paper. He unfolded it. He read it. Then, very quietly, he laughed. It was not the laugh of a man mocking her. It was the laugh of someone genuinely delighted, the involuntary kind that slips out before the person has time to consider whether it's appropriate. She had not heard anyone laugh at her like that in a very long time, as if she had said something wonderful rather than something strange. "You thought of everything," he said. "I try to," she said. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I'll agree to the provisional terms," he said. "I have one addendum to propose." She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "At the end of the 30 days," he said, "if we decide to proceed, the decision has to be made freely, not under pressure of the Hooper situation. If the only reason either of us is moving forward is because of the legal deadline, we stop and find another way to address the land issue." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was still coming through the window, golden and slow. "That's a very fair addendum," she said. "I thought so," he said. She put out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and he did not crush her hand the way some men did when they were trying to establish something. And she filed that away with the other things she had noticed about him. They rode out to the Keene Ranch that afternoon, her on the bay mare she'd had for 6 years and him on the big roan gelding that was, as he'd said, a good horse. He rode well, balanced and easy, without the tense over-control she sometimes saw in men who didn't actually trust their animals. She rode ahead, not because she was testing him, though perhaps she was a little, and he followed at a distance that was respectful without being distant. The ranch appeared through a stand of mesquite at the end of a long, straight track, and she watched him take it in. The main house was a solid adobe structure that her father had built in sections over 20 years, adding rooms as the need arose, so that it had an irregular, organic quality, like something that had grown rather than been constructed. The bunkhouse was newer, built by Stella herself with help from her hands after the old one was lost to a fire the year before. The barn was large and well-maintained. The fencing stretched out to the horizon in the afternoon light, clean and tight. The cattle she could see from the track, a respectable herd on the south pasture moving peacefully. "It's a good place," Albert said. "It is," Stella agreed, and the pride in her voice was quiet and absolute. Roy Briggs met them at the gate. Roy was 41, a weathered, taciturn man who had worked for Thomas Keene for 9 years and transferred his loyalty to Stella without apparent difficulty or need for discussion. He looked Albert over with the frank assessment of a man who has spent his life judging the character of horses and finds the method works reasonably well on people too. "New hand," Roy said to Stella. "Provisional," Stella said. "Roy Briggs, this is Albert Carver. He'll be with us for 30 days on a trial basis." Roy extended his hand. Albert shook it. Something passed between them in the grip that Stella did not entirely follow, but that seemed to end satisfactorily for both parties. Clem Turner appeared from the direction of the barn, a shorter, rounder man with a cheerful disposition that was entirely at odds with his ability to do hard physical work. He introduced himself to Albert with the enthusiastic goodwill of someone who enjoys having new people to talk to. Pete Navarro emerged last, ducking out from behind the barn door with the particular hunched quality of a boy who has recently had a growth spurt and has not yet made peace with the new height of all the doorways. He shook Albert's hand with serious formality and then went back to whatever he had been doing, because Pete was 17 and took his responsibilities gravely. Stella showed Albert the spare bunk and let him put his things away, and then she went inside and stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes closed. She was not sure what she had done. She was sure, which was its own kind of unsettling feeling, that she did not regret it. The first week passed the way first weeks in new arrangements always do, with everyone feeling slightly formal and slightly watchful. Albert slotted himself into the work of the ranch with a competence that was, she had to admit, impressive. He was not flashy about it. He did not try to demonstrate his abilities or take over jobs that belonged to other people. He simply showed up where he was needed and did what needed doing, whether that was mending a section of fence on the east boundary, or coaxing a temperamental heifer into accepting her calf, or spending 3 hours on a Friday clearing a blocked irrigation channel that had been on the list for a week, but kept getting displaced by more urgent tasks. Roy, who gave his approval slowly and in very small increments, told her at the end of the first week that Carver knew his cattle. This was, from Roy, roughly equivalent to a formal commendation. She and Albert ate dinner together most evenings at the big table in the main house, because it would have been strange and inhospitable to have him eat alone in the bunkhouse every night when she was eating alone in the house. The first few dinners were polite. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the water situation. They talked about the price of beef at the rail depot and whether it made more sense to bring the herd in early or hold them through October. By the end of the first week, they were talking about other things. He told her about Missouri and what it had looked like before the war changed it, the fields of corn and the big oaks along the creek bottoms, and the particular quality of summer evenings that he still sometimes dreamed about. She told him about growing up on this ranch, about learning to ride before she could read, about her father teaching her double-entry bookkeeping at the kitchen table because he said if she was going to inherit this land, she was going to understand every number on every page. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Albert said. "He was," she said. He believed that the land should go to whoever loved it and understood it, and he thought I loved and understood it better than anyone. She paused. He was right. I believe you, Albert said. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low between them, and outside the coyotes were talking to each other somewhere out on the flat desert, and she thought that there was something peculiar about how easily she had come to exist in the same space as this man. She had always preferred her own company, or the company of people she had known for years. This was new, and she was still examining it, the way she might examine a geological formation in the rock at the edge of her property, curious and careful. "Why did you really sign?" she asked. He considered the question. "I've been a man who works for other people my whole life," he said. "I'm good at it, but I've been watching for a long time for a way to be part of something instead of just labor in service of something." He paused. "The contract you wrote is the first legal arrangement I've ever encountered that treated the second party as a full participant instead of as an employee or a possession. That made me want to meet the person who wrote it." She was quiet for a moment. "And now that you've met her—" "Now that I've met her," he said, "I think the contract undersells her." She felt something shift in her chest, like a door she had not known was closed opening just a fraction. She did not acknowledge it, not yet, but she noted it carefully and filed it away. Gerald Hooper came to the ranch on a Wednesday in the second week, and he did not come alone. He came with his foreman, a large, flat-eyed man named Dupree, and a lawyer from out of county whose name was Albright and whose suit was too clean for the amount of dust on the road he had ridden in on, which told you something about how he had gotten there. Stella met them at the gate. She did not invite them in. "Miss Keene," Hooper said. He was a thick-set man of about 50 with a manner that was permanently positioned somewhere between friendliness and threat, like a dog that wags its tail while growling. "I've heard some talk in town, something about you posting a notice looking for a husband." "What I posted in town is my own business," Stella said. "The thing is," Hooper said, with the elaborate patience of a man who enjoys explaining things, "the petition I filed is progressing through the county courts, and I've been given to understand that a marriage contracted after the petition was filed may not satisfy the legal requirement in the deed clause. Mr. Albright here has been quite clear on that point." Albright, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. "It is a matter of some legal ambiguity," he said. "I have my own legal counsel," Stella said, which was true. She had written 3 letters to a lawyer in Tucson in the past month, 2 of which had received replies. "I'm aware of the legal situation." "Then you know," Hooper said, "that the simplest solution to all of this would be to let me make you a fair offer for the property. You'd walk away comfortable, enough to start fresh somewhere." "I have no interest in starting fresh somewhere," Stella said. "This is my land. My father homesteaded it. I was born on it. I intend to die on it, Mr. Hooper, at a very advanced age after a long and productive life. I suggest you find another way to expand your operation." Hooper's friendliness slipped a degree or two. Behind her, she heard the creak of the porch boards and knew without turning around that Albert had come out of the house. She heard him stop just behind her left shoulder. Hooper looked from her to Albert and back. "And who are you?" he said to Albert. "Albert Carver," Albert said pleasantly. "I work this ranch." "He's the foreman," Roy said from somewhere near the barn, and Stella felt the precise moment that title settled over Albert like something that fit him perfectly, even though it was the first time she had heard it used. Hooper looked at Albert for a long moment with the calculating expression of a man who is recalibrating. Then he looked back at Stella. "I'll be watching how this plays out," he said. "You do that," Stella said. They left. Stella did not move until their horses had turned out of sight at the end of the track, and then she let out a long, slow breath and turned around. Albert was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed. He did not look alarmed. He looked, if anything, steady, the way a post that has been properly sunk in good ground looks when something tries to push against it. "Foreman," she said. "If that's all right," he said. "It's more than all right," she said. "It's accurate." That evening after dinner she got out the contract and they went through it together, sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table with the lamp between them. It was the first time she had gone through it with anyone, clause by clause, and she had expected it to feel exposing. Instead, it felt like a conversation she had been trying to have for a long time with someone who spoke the right language. He had questions about the property ownership clause. She explained the legal basis for it, the challenge of women's property rights in the territory, and what she had modeled it on. He had a suggestion about the language in paragraph 4 that she turned over in her head and then agreed was clearer. He asked about the clause regarding decisions in the event of a fundamental disagreement, the one that specified a process of mediation before either party could take unilateral action. That one was the hardest to write, she admitted. Why? Because it assumes that disagreements will happen, she said, and it assumes that both people are capable of being wrong. Those are not comfortable assumptions. They're honest ones, he said. Yes, she said. That's why they were hard. He looked at her. The lamp threw warm light across his face, and she was struck again by that quality of stillness in him, not passivity, not absence, but the stillness of something that has its own internal weather and does not need to borrow from the weather outside. I'm going to tell you something, he said. All right. When I walked into that store and read your contract, I had been on the road for 3 weeks, and I was tired in the way that goes deeper than the body. I'd been thinking about what I was doing and where I was going, and I'd come up empty every time. He paused. Reading what you wrote was the first time in 3 weeks that I'd read something that made sense to me. Not just sense the way a fence post makes sense, but sense the way a direction makes sense. Do you understand what I mean? She understood. She understood it the way you understand something that has been true for a while before you find the words for it. I'm glad you walked into that store, she said. He smiled. It changed his face in a way she had not seen before, opening it up, softening the line of his jaw, putting something warm and unguarded in his eyes. She thought she would like to see that smile more. So am I, he said. They sat with that for a moment, and outside the coyotes started up again, and the lamp burned quietly between them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything. The second week turned into the third, and something was happening between them that Stella would not have been able to put into a legal clause if she had tried. It was in the way he always noticed when she was carrying something heavy and came to help without making a production of it, without the performative chivalry that she had always found condescending. It was in the way she found herself looking for him when she came in from morning rounds, the specific thing her eyes did when they found him on the opposite side of the yard, the slight adjustment in her chest, like a compass needle settling. It was in their evenings, which had become something she protected from interruption the way she protected the water rights. They talked about everything. She had not talked to anyone like this since her father died. The kind of talking where you are not managing impressions or being careful, where you are simply thinking out loud with someone who thinks alongside you. He told her about a book he had read 3 times, a history of the Roman Republic that he had found in a trading post in New Mexico and carried all the way to Arizona. She told him about the astronomy her father had taught her, standing in the yard at night and naming the constellations. He said he didn't know the constellations, and she said she would show him. And so they went outside after dinner into the enormous Arizona darkness, and she pointed them out one by one, and he stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air, and she was aware of exactly how many inches were between them. She told him about the water rights dispute 3 years ago, the one with the irrigation company that had tried to reroute the creek that fed her south pasture. She had won that dispute in county court without a lawyer, representing herself with 3 months of legal research and a very organized filing system, and it was one of the things she was most proud of in her life. He listened to the whole account and said, at the end of it, "I would have liked to see you in that courtroom." "Why?" she asked. "Because I imagine you were magnificent," he said, and said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than flattery. She felt warmth rise in her face and was glad it was dark. On a Thursday night in the third week, there was a storm. It came in from the northwest with the sudden, theatrical violence of Arizona summer storms. And by the time the sky opened up, the lightning was already cracking across the mesa to the west, and the cattle in the south pasture were anxious. Stella pulled on her coat and went out, and Albert was already there, and Roy and Clem. And they spent 2 hours in the rain, and the dark getting the herd settled, and the barn doors secured, and the young stock into shelter. By the time they were done, they were soaked through and covered in mud and breathing hard, and Stella was standing in the barn doorway watching the lightning move east and feeling oddly elated the way she always did after hard physical work successfully completed. Albert came to stand beside her. He was waterlogged, his dark hair flat against his head, his coat heavy with rain. "Everyone's accounted for?" she asked. "All cattle present and no fencing down," he said. "Roy's checking the north boundary." "Clem's with the horses," she nodded. They stood watching the storm retreat, and then he said very quietly, "Stella." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was careful and open at once, like a man who is about to say something true and knows it cannot be taken back. "I don't want the 30 days to end," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Rain was dripping from the barn roof in a long curtain behind them. Somewhere out in the dark, a cow was lowing softly, reassured by the sound of her own voice. "Neither do I," she said. He reached up and touched her face, very carefully, with the backs of his fingers, brushing a strand of wet hair away from her cheek. She did not step back. She stepped forward just slightly, the half-inch that meant something, and he understood it, because he was a man who paid attention. He kissed her gently, with the same quality of careful honesty that he brought to everything else. She kissed him back with more conviction than she had known she was carrying, and the rain went on behind them and the lightning moved east, and when they finally separated, she was looking at him with wide eyes and a feeling in her chest like something that has been held very tight for a very long time finally being released. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She laughed. He laughed. And that was the beginning of the second thing, the thing underneath the contract and the practicalities, the thing that had been growing in the quiet evening conversations and the shared work, and the way he looked at her like she was a complete and serious person worthy of complete and serious attention. On the following Monday, she rode into Red Rock Crossing alone to meet with Daniel Frost, her lawyer from Tucson who had made the trip specifically to discuss the Hooper petition. Frost was a thin, careful man of about 40 who had been practicing law in Arizona Territory for 12 years, and who had seen enough cases of women being maneuvered out of their inheritance to have firm opinions on the subject. They met in the back room of the Justice of the Peace's office, which the Justice, an accommodating man named Harlow, allowed to be used for legal consultations when no court business was scheduled. Frost spread his papers on the table. The situation, he explained, was complex. The deed clause that Hooper was exploiting had been written in 1869 and was language carried over from a territorial ordinance that itself derived from older property law that had not been meaningfully updated to reflect the Married Women's Property Act that some states were beginning to adopt, though Arizona Territory was not among the leaders in this regard. The petition Hooper had filed was based on a reading of that clause that was arguable but not baseless. A recent marriage would satisfy the primary condition, but Hooper's lawyer was correct that there was a secondary argument about the timing. "However," Frost said, "I have found a competing interpretation based on a case decided in the New Mexico Territory in 1879 that suggests the condition is satisfied by the marital status at the time of the petition's adjudication, not at the time of the filing. If that interpretation holds, then a marriage contracted now would absolutely resolve the petition." "How confident are you in that interpretation?" Stella asked. "Moderately," he said. "More confident if the judge assigned to adjudicate is Callaway rather than Brixton, and which judge handles Red Rock County petitions." "Currently, Callaway," Frost said, with the precise satisfaction of a man delivering good news he has been saving. Stella thought about this. Then she said, "And if I contest the underlying ordinance itself, the 1869 clause?" Frost looked at her. "That would be a longer fight," he said. "I know, but it's the right fight. That clause should not exist. It treats women as dependent variables in a property equation rather than as legal persons in their own right, and that is a fundamental injustice regardless of what it means for my particular situation." Frost studied her for a moment. "You understand that contesting the ordinance would not be resolved quickly. We're talking about months, possibly a year or more." "I understand. I want to proceed on both tracks. Resolve the immediate situation with the marriage argument and simultaneously build the challenge to the ordinance itself." She folded her hands on the table. "The injustice doesn't stop being an injustice because I personally managed to get around it this time. There are other women in this territory in similar situations who do not have the option I have." Frost looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Keene, I have practiced law for 12 years and I have had perhaps 4 clients who thought about their legal situation in those terms." "Then those were 4 good clients," she said. He smiled. "They were." She rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light with the specific clarity of a woman who knows what she is doing and why she is doing it. And when she came through the gate, Albert was working with Pete on one of the young horses near the corral, patient and methodical, talking Pete through the handling with a quiet authority that made the boy stand straighter. She pulled up and watched them for a moment without being noticed. There was something about watching him with Pete that moved her in a way she had not entirely expected. It was care, offered without calculation, to a young person who needed someone to take him seriously. Pete Navarro was an orphan, had been since he was 12, and he had come to the Keene ranch 2 years ago on foot with a bruise on his jaw and very little else. And Stella had given him a place without asking too many questions, because some questions are less important than the answer being yes. Watching Albert explain the pressure points on a horse's neck to Pete with the same seriousness he brought to his conversations with her, she felt something settle even deeper. She dismounted and led her horse toward the barn, and Albert looked up and saw her. He nodded once, a small gesture that contained a great deal, and she nodded back, and Pete looked between them with the frank curiosity of a teenager and then turned back to the horse because the horse was more immediately comprehensible. That evening she told him about the meeting with Frost. He listened to all of it, including the part about the ordinance challenge, and when she finished he said, "So what's the timeline?" "Frost believes we need to be legally married within the next 3 weeks if we want to have the petition resolved before it reaches the adjudication date." 3 weeks, he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are we doing this because of the petition or because we want to?" She looked at him. It was the question from the addendum from that first day. He had not forgotten it. "I'm going to answer that honestly," she said. 3 weeks ago I would have told you it was about the petition. Right now I'm telling you that the petition is a reason for the timing and not for the decision." She paused. "I want to do this, not because of Hooper. Because of what has been happening in this kitchen every evening and in this yard, every morning, and in a barn doorway in the middle of a rainstorm." He looked at her with that open, careful expression that she had come to know was his version of revealing something important. "I want to do this," he said, "for the same reasons." They sat with that. Then she said, "There's still a week left of the 30 days. "There is," he said. "We should use it." "Agreed," he said. She put out her hand. He took it. They sat at the kitchen table holding hands across the space where the lamp burned between them. And she thought that this was the most natural and also the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to her, which was saying something for a woman who had won a water rights case pro se and had written her own marriage contract. In the final week of the evaluation period, they took a Sunday afternoon and rode out to the far edge of the North Pasture together, to a place where a series of red rock formations created a kind of natural shelter, and where she had spent many hours of her childhood with a book or simply with the sky and the land. She had shown this place to no one else. Not even her father had known exactly where she went when she needed to be alone, and the fact that she was bringing Albert here was not lost on her. They sat on the flat rock above the formations and looked out across the ranch and the desert beyond, and the distant mountains that went blue at this hour of the afternoon. He asked her what she was thinking, and she told him the truth, that she was thinking about her father and how much she would have wanted him to be here, and that she thought Thomas Keene would have approved of Albert Carver, which was the highest compliment she knew how to offer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was like you." "How so?" "She was the practical one, the one who kept everything running. My father was a good man, but he dreamed outward all the time. He was always looking at the horizon, and she kept the near ground solid." He paused. "She died the year before I left Missouri. I think if she'd lived I would have stayed." "Do you wish you'd stayed?" He thought about it genuinely. "No," he said. "I think the road led here, and I'm glad of where I am." He looked at her. Very glad. They were sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not move away, and he did not move away, and they watched the afternoon light change on the rock formations until the shadows grew long and it was time to ride back. On the last night of the 30 days, they sat at the kitchen table and went through the contract one final time. She had a clean copy ready, the one that had not been pinned to a notice board in a general store, written out in her best hand on good paper, with all the modifications and clarifications they had discussed incorporated into the language. He read it through slowly and carefully as he had read it the first time, and when he finished he looked up at her. "I have one more thing to add," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "At this stage?" "One more clause," he said. "I'd like to add a clause about love." She looked at him. "Love is not a legally enforceable concept," she said, and was aware as she said it that she was being a lawyer about something that was not a legal matter. "I know," he said. "But I'd like it in the contract anyway, not as a legal obligation, as a statement of intent." He paused. "I'd like it on record that I intend to love you well, Stella, honestly and consistently and with respect for who you are. I want that written down not because I think you need a legal guarantee, but because I think things that matter should be stated clearly." He held her gaze. "You taught me that." She looked at him for a very long time. The lamp burned. The coyotes were quiet tonight. The house around them was solid and still, the adobe walls that her father had built room by room over 20 years, the floors she had swept since she was old enough to hold a broom, the kitchen where she had learned to cook and to read and to add columns of numbers and to think of herself as someone who was capable of taking up the right amount of space in the world. She picked up the pen. In the margin of the last page, below the numbered clauses and above the signature lines, she wrote a short paragraph. Her handwriting was precise and even. She wrote that both parties entered this arrangement with the intention not merely of legal partnership, but of genuine affection, mutual respect, and the ongoing effort to love each other honestly and well, understanding that love in practice is a matter of daily decision and not merely a feeling. She turned the contract to face him. He read what she had written. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name on the lower line, Albert J. Carver, in a clear, deliberate hand. She signed hers below it. Stella Keene, and she had not yet added Carver to it. That would come when it was made official, but looking at their names together on the page she felt something complete about it, like the last piece of a fence line being strung and the whole boundary now being sound. "Where do I sign?" she said softly, echoing his words from that first day in the store. He smiled. "You already did." They were married 3 days later at the Justice of the Peace's office in Reed Rock Crossing. It was not a large wedding, because neither of them had asked for one. Roy and Clem and Pete came in from the ranch and stood in the small office in their best shirts, which were still work shirts, but were cleaner than usual. Emmett Foss came from the general store. Daniel Frost had ridden back down from Tucson and arrived that morning because he said he would not miss it, and she suspected also because he wanted to be present in case Hooper tried any last-minute legal maneuvers, which showed that Frost was both a good friend and a thorough lawyer. Justice Harlow performed the ceremony with the comfortable brevity of a man who has done this many times and knows, the The weight of the words does not require additional decoration. He asked the questions. They answered them. When he asked if anyone present had cause to object, there was a brief, charged silence, and then Harlow nodded and moved on, and Stella had to work to keep the smile off her face at the audacity of Harlow asking that question in this particular situation. Albert took her hand when Harlow said to, and held it with the same care he brought to everything, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and the whole room fell quiet in the way rooms fall quiet when something real is happening in them. Harlow said, "You may kiss the bride." Albert turned to her. She looked at him. She went up on her toes and kissed him first, because she was Stella Keene and she had written her own marriage contract, and she was not about to wait for permission. And he kissed her back with his hand warm at her waist. And Roy and Clem both cleared their throats in the particular way of men who are moved but would prefer not to have it said so. And Pete Navarro grinned the wide, unguarded grin of a boy who was watching something he thought was good. Frost filed the marriage certificate with the county clerk that afternoon. The following week, he submitted the formal response to Hooper's petition, citing the marriage and the New Mexico precedent, and 3 additional legal arguments that he had clearly been saving for the occasion. Hooper's lawyer, Mr. Albright of the Too Clean suit, filed a counter-response that Stella read carefully and found weaker than she had feared. Judge Calloway adjudicated the petition 6 weeks after the wedding, on a cool October morning, and ruled in Stella's favor. The deed clause, he found, was satisfied by the marital status at the time of adjudication, and moreover, he added in a passage that Stella read 3 times to be sure she had understood it correctly. The petition itself showed evidence of having been filed in bad faith as a means of exploiting a legal technicality rather than addressing a genuine property dispute. Gerald Hooper received the ruling at his ranch and did not come back to contest it. Frost was already building the ordinance challenge, and Stella corresponded with him about it twice a month, and though it would be a long fight, she had never expected it to be a quick one. Some things worth doing are not quick. She knew that. In the meantime, life on the Keene ranch continued with the addition of Albert Carver, who was now also Albert Keene Carver according to a small amendment they had negotiated to their contract in the week before the wedding, reflecting the fact that the ranch's name and legacy were Stella's, and that a name, like land, carries history that should be respected. He had insisted on it. She had argued that he did not have to. He had said that it was a matter of honesty, that this was her place first, and he was joining it rather than absorbing it, and she had accepted the argument because it was a good one. The work of the ranch went on as it always had, cattle and fencing and water management, and the slow, constant attention that a piece of land demands from the people who love it. Albert took the foreman role seriously, without ever losing the quality of partnership that had made Stella say yes. They made decisions together, about the herd and the finances and the long-term plans for the property. He had ideas she had not thought of, including a proposal for a small breeding program with higher quality stock that would improve the value of their cattle over time. And she had ideas he had not thought of, including an analysis of water-sharing arrangements with 2 neighboring properties that could benefit all parties and reduce the expense of well maintenance. Roy watched all of this with his characteristic minimal expression and occasional laconic approval. Clem talked about it freely with everyone in Reed Rock Crossing, so that the story of Stella Keene's marriage contract became a staple of conversation at the general store and the diner and the church social. Emmett Foss, who had witnessed the whole beginning of it, accepted this celebrity with dignity and only corrected the most egregious factual errors. Pete Navarro turned 18 in November, and they celebrated with a dinner at the main house and a cake that Stella baked from a recipe her mother had left in the old cookbook that lived on the kitchen shelf. Pete sat at the table looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention and the cake, and Albert gave him a good leather pair of gloves that Pete would use until they fell apart, and Stella gave him formal papers making him a full working member of the ranch crew with the rights and pay that went with it. Pete looked at the papers for a long time and then looked up with very bright eyes and said, "Thank you, Miss Stella," and Stella said, "Mrs. Keene Carver, and you're welcome." She said it gently, and Pete smiled, and Albert reached over and covered her hand with his where it lay on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his. The winter came and was a good one, cold but not brutal, with enough rain to fill the stock tanks, and a light snowfall in January that blanketed the desert for 2 days before it melted and left everything clean and shining. Stella and Albert developed the particular domestic rhythms of two people who have decided to be good to each other, and are finding, to their continuing satisfaction, that the decision holds up in practice. She discovered that he made the best coffee she had ever tasted, by some method involving the temperature of the water and the specific grind of the bean that he refused to explain beyond saying that it was a matter of patience. He discovered that she woke up fully functional while he required at least 30 minutes to become a complete person in the morning, and rather than finding this failing annoying, she found it endearing and made sure the coffee pot was always ready when he came to the kitchen. She told him things about herself that she had not told anyone, about the specific loneliness of being a woman who ran her own ranch in a territory that did not quite know what to do with her. About the evenings after her father died, when the house had been so quiet that she had talked out loud to herself, just to have a voice in the air. About the 3 proposals she had declined and why, and what she had understood about what she actually wanted from sitting with those 3 polite or outraged or soaked refusals. He told her about the 2 years when he had been very alone, after his mother died, and before the ranch work had started to feel like a life, rather than just a series of days. About the book about the Roman Republic that had felt like a companion in a way that embarrassed him to admit. About the specific quality of the loneliness that comes from being capable and useful, but having no particular place where that capability belongs. "It belongs here," she said. "It does," he said. "I knew it would when I read the contract." "You didn't know anything about here when you read the contract." "I knew enough," he said. "I knew the person who wrote it would be someone worth knowing." She looked at him in the winter lamplight. "You were right about that," she said. "I was right about several things," he said, and smiled, and she leaned across the table and kissed him because he was right and also because she wanted to. Spring came to the Arizona territory with its particular extravagance, the desert exploding into bloom in the way that always took her breath away, no matter how many springs she had seen. The new calves were coming and the operation was running well, and Frost wrote to tell her that the Ordnance Challenge had found its first favorable hearing in a sympathetic county judge, who had agreed to hear the argument on its merits, which was a beginning. It was on a clear April evening, with the last of the sunset still on the western horizon, that Albert found her sitting on the porch with the ranch books closed on her lap, and a particular look on her face that he had learned to read, the look that meant something had happened inside her head that she was still turning over. He sat beside her in the other porch chair. "Tell me," he said. She looked out at the yard and the corral and the pasture beyond and the cattle moving peacefully in the last light. "I think I'm going to have a child," she said. The quiet that followed was different from other quiets. It was full of something. "You think or you know," he said. "I'm fairly certain," she said. "I have been for about 2 weeks. I wanted to be more certain before I said anything." He was quiet for another moment. Then she felt his hand cover hers where it rested on the closed ranch book. She looked at him. His face in the fading light was open in the way she loved, unguarded, everything in it available to be read. "How are you feeling about it?" he said. She loved him for asking that first, before anything else. "Terrified," she said honestly, "and very glad. Both of those seem correct to me," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat there on the porch of the house her father had built, looking out at the land she had fought to keep and the evening coming down over it, and she thought that this was a thing she had not known how to want before she had it, which was perhaps the truest thing about the best things. Their son was born in December, on a cold night with stars so thick and bright they looked painted, which meant that Pete, who had become almost as invested in the astronomy lessons as Albert had, went out to the yard to look at them while the midwife from town worked inside. Roy and Clem waited in the kitchen drinking coffee and not talking much, which was Roy's natural state and Clem's managed best effort at solidarity. Albert was in the room with her. She had stated this plainly to the midwife and to every other person who had offered an opinion on the matter, and she had offered no further explanation than that it was her preference, and the terms of the arrangement did not require one. The midwife, a pragmatic woman named Mrs. Aldridge who had been delivering babies in this county for 30 years, had accepted this without particular objection, which made Stella like her very much. It was a long night and a hard one, as first births tend to be, but not a dangerous one, and when it was over and she was exhausted and upright and holding a red, outraged, entirely healthy baby boy, she looked at Albert and his face was undone in the way that only a very few things can undo a person, and she thought that she would carry the precise image of his face in that moment for the rest of her life. "Hello," he said to the baby very softly, with the particular gentleness of a man who understands that something profound is happening and does not want to be less than the moment requires. The baby, whose lungs were already demonstrating excellent capacity, gradually stopped shouting and blinked at the lamp and at the two faces looking down at him. "Thomas," Stella said. "For my father." Albert looked at her. "Thomas Albert," he said. "Thomas Albert Keene Carver," she said. "Yes." Roy, when he was allowed in, looked at the baby with his standard minimal expression and said, "Good size," which from Roy was practically a speech. Clem cried openly and did not apologize for it. Pete looked at the baby with wide, reverent eyes, and then at Albert, and then at Stella and said, "Is he always going to be that color?" Which made everyone laugh and turned some of the tension in the room into something easy and warm. Thomas Albert Keene Carver grew from a loud, emphatic baby into a sturdy toddler with his father's steady dark eyes and his mother's auburn coloring, and an opinion about absolutely everything, which he expressed with the confidence of a person who has never been told that what he thinks is not worth saying. Stella watched this development with satisfaction. She had always believed that people should feel entitled to their own opinions, and that the proper age to begin was as early as possible. The ordinance challenge wound its way through the courts over the following 2 years, slowly and with the setbacks that Frost had predicted and that Stella had prepared herself for. She traveled to Tucson twice to meet with Frost and to sit in on hearings, leaving Albert in charge of the ranch, which he managed with the thoroughness she had come to expect. She corresponded with 2 other women in the territory who had been following the case, one a widow in the southern counties and one a schoolteacher near the New Mexico border, both of whom had property situations that the same unjust ordinance had complicated. She shared Frost's legal strategy with them and encouraged them to join as parties to the challenge, which strengthened the case considerably. The ruling came on a Wednesday in September when Thomas was 2.5 years old, and causing significant havoc in the garden with a stick he had decided was a weapon of some kind. Frost's letter arrived in the afternoon post, and Stella read it standing at the kitchen table while Thomas banged the stick on the porch boards outside and Albert came in from the yard with mud on his boots. "Good news or bad news?" Albert asked, reading her expression. She looked up. "The ordinance challenge succeeded," she said. "Partially. The 1869 clause has been struck as applied to women who inherit property directly. It doesn't solve everything. There will still be fights to be had. But the specific injustice that Hooper tried to use against this ranch is no longer legally viable." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took the letter from her hand and read it himself. She watched him read it. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her with the kind of look that she had catalogued carefully over 3 years and still found new things in. "You did that," he said. "Frost did the legal work. You made it happen," he said. You could have just gotten married and solved your own problem and left the ordinance in place. You didn't. It wasn't just my problem, she said. He put his hands on her face and kissed her the way he sometimes kissed her, when he was very full of something that words were not adequate for, with intention and warmth, and the specific tenderness of a man who knows what he has and is grateful for it every single day. Outside, Thomas had found something more interesting than the stick, and was now attempting to introduce himself to one of the barn cats, with the diplomatic approach of a person who does not yet understand that barn cats are not interested in diplomacy. They pulled apart and looked through the open kitchen door at their son and the unimpressed cat, and the warm September afternoon, and the ranch stretching out around them in all directions. "I want to write to the other women," she said. "The widow and the school teacher, they should know. Write to them tonight," he said. "I'll handle supper." She looked at him. "You'll handle supper." "I've been known to manage a meal on occasion," he said. "You've been known to manage very good coffee," she said. "The meals are more variable." "I'll do my best," he said. She went to her desk and took out paper and pen and began to write. Albert went to the kitchen and began, with the characteristic thoroughness he applied to everything, to work out what supper was going to be. Thomas came in from the porch with a fresh smear of dirt on his face and an expression of someone who has been engaged in important work. And Albert caught him at the door and wiped his face with a cloth and sent him to play in the parlor while supper was made. And Thomas went because Albert had long since established that he was the kind of authority worth listening to. Stella wrote her letters. Downstairs her husband cooked their meal and their son played in the parlor with the toy horse that Pete had carved for him, the one with the carefully painted brown coat and the white star on the forehead. Outside, the Arizona evening settled over the land she had fought for and kept and built upon, the land where her father was buried under the mesquite at the north boundary, and where she intended to be buried someday herself, at a very advanced age after a long and productive life. She had said that to Hooper once in anger and defiance. It was no less true for having been true, and now it had a different quality to it, the quality of something that is not just intention but is actually becoming, day by day. The life she had outlined in 4 pages of careful handwriting in the kitchen of this house on a cold winter night when she was alone and uncertain and determined to be neither of those things for longer than she could help. The following spring, a second pregnancy announced itself, this one with more confidence and less terror on both sides, because they knew what they were doing now. Thomas, who was 3 and very concerned about his position in the household, received the news with the calculating interest of someone who understands that situations have structural implications. He asked if the new baby would be a boy or a girl, and Stella said they would see, and he considered this for a while, and said he would prefer a boy because then he could teach him things, and she exchanged a look with Albert over Thomas's head that contained volumes. The baby was a girl, which Thomas approached with initial skepticism that melted within approximately 2 weeks into the fiercest, most disproportionate sibling devotion that anyone on the ranch had ever witnessed. He called her Rosie because her full name, Rose Clara Keene Carver, named for Albert's mother Clara, was longer than he wanted to deal with at age 3. And Rosie she became to everyone on the ranch regardless of what the official documents said. She had Albert's dark eyes, and it became clear as she grew, her mother's absolute certainty about what she wanted and her complete willingness to go after it, which made her simultaneously the most charming and the most exhausting child that Stella had ever encountered. And she said this out loud to Albert one evening when they were sitting on the porch listening to the children inside being unquiet, and he said, "She gets it from you," and she said, "She gets the best of it from me," and he said, "That's not wrong," and she leaned against him and felt the satisfaction of a life that has turned out to be exactly what it should be, not by chance but by stubbornness and clear thinking and one very precisely written document. Pete Navarro, who was 22 now and no longer ducking doorways because he had finally made peace with his height, had been given increasing responsibility on the ranch over the years, and was showing every indication of being the kind of natural ranch manager who could handle anything that came at him with patience and skill. Stella had been thinking about this for some time, and in the autumn after Rosie's first birthday, she had a conversation with Albert about Pete's future that led to a proposal they brought to Pete on a Sunday afternoon. The proposal was this: a small parcel of land on the eastern edge of the Keene Carver property, 12 acres that ran along the creek, would be formally transferred to Pete Navarro as his own. He could work it independently, with the support of the ranch operation, and over time build whatever kind of future he wanted on it. Pete sat across from them at the kitchen table where Stella had done so much of the important business of her life, and looked at the papers she slid toward him and was very quiet for a while. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We know," Stella said. "We want to." "You came here with nothing," Albert said. "And you've built something here through your own work and your own character. This is just the land catching up to what's true." Pete looked at the papers. Then he looked up. He was a young man now, with calloused hands and the particular straight-backed quality of someone who has learned their own worth through the evidence of their own effort, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has been given something that they had not allowed themselves to want because wanting it felt too dangerous. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was past words. Roy retired from full-time ranch work the following year, which was 1889. When the Arizona Territory was talking about statehood, and the railroad was pushing further into the desert, and the world was changing in its usual relentless way. He stayed on the property in a comfortable arrangement that Stella had worked out with him, light work in exchange for his bunk and board, because Roy had no family to go to and no desire to go anywhere, and the Keene Carver Ranch was the only place he had been in 20 years that felt like his own, which was something. Clem stayed on as the senior hand, and hired 2 new men who he trained with the thoroughness of someone who takes the passing on of knowledge seriously. The ranch grew in modest increments over those years, not because Stella and Albert pursued expansion aggressively, but because they made good decisions consistently. And good decisions made over years tend to compound in the same way that poor ones do, only in the other direction. Frost wrote to tell her that the ordinance ruling had been cited in 2 subsequent cases in Arizona Territory, and once in a case in New Mexico, which meant that what she had started in a county courthouse with 4 pages of careful arguments was working its way outward through the legal fabric of the Western Territories, slowly and imperfectly, as such things do. She wrote back to congratulate him and to ask what the next argument was, because there were always more arguments to make. Thomas started school in Reed Rock Crossing and quickly identified his preferred method of learning, which was to ask questions until the teacher ran out of answers, and then to go find the answers elsewhere, a trait that caused some frustration at school and considerable satisfaction at home. Rosie, who was 3 years younger, watched her brother with the bright, assessing eyes of a person taking careful notes, and planned to do everything better, which she was well on her way to achieving before she had even started school herself. The evenings were still their best hours, hers and Albert's, the time after the children were settled and the work of the day was done, when the house was quiet and the lamp burned, and they talked about everything, and nothing, with the ease of 2 people who have spent years learning each other's language and now speak it fluently. She still surprised him, and he still surprised her, which she considered the essential sign of health in any partnership, and they still disagreed with enough regularity to require the mediation process outlined in Clause 7 of the original contract, which they had invoked 3 times in 6 years, each time finding their way to an agreement that neither would have reached alone. She kept the contract in the wooden box in her desk, the one with the brass clasp that had been her father's. She took it out occasionally, not from sentiment, though there was sentiment attached to it, but to remind herself of what she had been thinking when she wrote it, the precision of it, the honesty of it, The way it had said out loud the things she had believed so clearly and for so long without ever having had anyone to say them to. One evening in the spring of 1890, when the territory was full of talk about statehood and the future and what the next decade might bring, she took it out and read it through, and Albert, who had come into the study to bring her a cup of coffee, saw what she was reading and sat down across from her and waited. "All of it held up," she said. "All of it," he said. "Every clause," she said. "We've lived inside this document for 7 years and every clause held up." He looked at her with that open, warm expression that she still loved, that she thought she would love for another 40 years if she was lucky enough to have them. "You wrote it that way," he said. "I wrote it for someone I hadn't met yet," she said. "Someone I wasn't sure existed. And then I walked into that store," he said. "And then you walked into that store and asked where to sign," she said. "Without even knowing me. I knew enough," he said. "I knew the person who wrote that contract was someone who thought clearly and cared deeply, and would not waste my time or hers on anything less than the truth." She looked at him across the desk. This man she had not known 7 years ago, who had ridden in from nowhere with trail dust on his coat and $140 in his boot, and the willingness to read 4 pages of marriage terms with genuine attention and say yes to all of them, who had worked her land and built something alongside her and raised 2 children with her and held her hand through the court hearings and the hard winters and all the ordinary difficult days that make up a life. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said the things she was most certain of, without decoration, with complete and quiet conviction. "I love you," he said, the same way. They sat with that in the warm lamplight of the study, with the contract open on the desk between them and the children asleep down the hall and the ranch settled around them in the spring night. And outside the stars were laid out across the Arizona sky in the same patterns she had learned from her father and taught to Albert, and were now beginning to teach to Thomas, who was already asking questions that went past the names into the physics of them. Because Thomas always went past the names into the questions underneath. Rosie would ask the questions too, in her own time, in her own way. And Pete's 12 acres along the creek were already showing what could grow from good soil and steady attention. And Roy was somewhere in the bunkhouse, probably asleep or possibly reading the newspaper, which had become his retirement activity of choice. And Clem's laugh could occasionally be heard from the direction of the barn at this hour, because Clem was a social creature, and the new hands tolerated him fondly. The Keene Carver ranch was a living thing, and it was alive because she had refused to let it die, and because a stranger had walked into a general store on a Tuesday morning and read 4 pages of her most honest thoughts and said without hesitation, "Where do I sign?" She picked up the contract and folded it carefully along its old creases and put it back in the brass-clasped box. Albert watched her do it. When she closed the box, he reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, as she had done at this table since very nearly the beginning, and the lamp burned between them, warm and constant, and outside the night lay over the desert they loved like something patient and enormous and full of stars. She had written a contract for a partner she was not sure existed, and it had found him, the way a river finds the shape of the land, inevitably, as if it had always been going toward that particular place. She had written what she believed and what she needed and what she thought was fair and true, and he had read it and said yes to every word of it. And in the 7 years since they had lived inside those words and found them not a constraint but a foundation, the kind you build on rather than around, Thomas would grow up knowing that his parents had met in a way that made the whole county shake their heads with fond exasperation, and had built something solid and good from that improbable beginning. Rosie would grow up knowing that women could write their own terms, and that the right person would read them and say yes. Pete would stand on his 12 acres with his own name on the deed, and know what it meant when someone sees what you are worth and acts accordingly. These things were the work, alongside the cattle and the fencing and the water rights and the legal arguments and all the ordinary, extraordinary labor of making a life in a hard country. These were the things that would remain after them, in the people they had been good to, and the land they had kept sound, and the 2 children who carried their names and their natures out into whatever future was coming. Stella Keene Carver sat in the lamplight of her father's house with her husband's hand in hers, and the contract in its box, and her children down the hall and the ranch all around her in the Arizona night. And she thought that she had been very stubborn and very precise and very lucky, in that order, and that all 3 were required, and that she would not have changed a single word of what she had written. The spring wind moved over the desert outside, warm and carrying the scent of creosote and the distant sweetness of blooming palo verde, and the lamp burned on, and the stars turned slowly in their ancient courses overhead, and the life that 2 people had built from a handshake and 4 pages of honest terms continued on, full and imperfect and entirely, completely theirs.